Hey everyone, and welcome to video 4.1.6 for the Legal Studies Guide. Straight into our quote today from Lara Stone. I think of dieting, then I eat pizza. Don't know about you guys, but I am a huge pizza fan. But yeah, not looking at this quote purely from the view of food, but that concept of, we only get one chance at life. Try and do the things that you enjoy, right? Don't, limit yourself because there's some idea that it's the best thing to do or whatever. Try and enjoy the moments that you have. So within, the stressful nature of your year 12 year and everything that's, being thrown at you, while you're working towards exams, try and find some time in there to eat the pizza and make sure that you are looking after yourself. So 4.1.6 today, we're looking at checking Parliament's lawmaking again. So our last dot point was about the factors that affect Parliament's ability to make a law. So sort of, limitations that are placed on Parliament. And we're doing really similar, checks on Parliament's lawmaking again today. But this time we're focusing on checks that are provided by the Australian Constitution. So, what actual things do we have, or what mechanisms exist within the Constitution that limit Parliament's lawmaking? So, check, by check again, we mean limit. So, what things are there in the Constitution that limit Parliament's lawmaking? And obviously, we're going to, be doing some discussion evaluation on that. So, to what extent do they actually check Parliament's lawmaking, and is that a good thing? Are they positive checks? Are they good for us, or are they not? So there's three things listed that we need to learn about. The role of the High Court in protecting the principle of representative government. So we'll talk about a case there. The separation of powers and the express protection of rights. At the end of this, if someone's waving a copy of the Constitution at you, because, we all carry those around, and they say, hey, I don't know what this thing is. What does this thing do? Why is it important? You'll hopefully be able to give them a really detailed answer around how that document acts as a check on Parliament in lawmaking. So, first thing to consider, and I won't dwell on this too long, but you can pause and have a think about this, is why? Why do we need a check on lawmaking? Why do we actually need to place some kind of limitations on Parliament? What are some of the issues that could occur if Parliament had no limitations placed on it? And that's something that you can think about yourself. That's where you might be thinking about perhaps, some other countries in the world where maybe these checks aren't placed on parliaments or leaders in those locations and what the impact of that can be. Our first specific part of this dot point we need to talk about is the High Court and representative government. So the role of the High Court in protecting, so that's a really important word, protecting representative government. Now, we've talked about representative government before in factors affecting Parliament's ability to make law. Representative government is that idea that Parliament should only pass laws that are in the interests of the people. Parliament needs to work for the people. Parliament needs to represent the people. So how does the Constitution protect this? So, similar to with our factors affecting Parliament, I'll talk about what the check is. So exactly the content, the underpinning, what is it in the Constitution, and then we'll talk about how it actually limits. Again, how it actually limits Parliament's ability to make laws. So as we know, government, Parliament in lawmaking has to represent the views of the people. If they don't, they're going to be voted out. We're going to vote for someone else. There's three really important sections of the Constitution, probably two super important sections of the Constitution, and then Section 28 as well, that really enshrine this concept of representative government. And that's Section 7, which is about the Senate, which says that members of the Senate must be directly chosen by the people, so elections. And Section 24, which says members of the House of Representatives must be directly chosen by the people. So again, elections. So the Constitution really clearly lays out, hey, you must be, if you're a politician, you must be someone that is directly chosen by the people. So how does that put a limit on Parliament in lawmaking? How does that check Parliament's lawmaking? Well, first of all, it just means we have to have elections. Parliament can't get rid of elections. Like, Parliament can't pass a law that says no more elections because it clearly says Senate elections or senators are elected for 6 years, House of Reps for 3 years, and they must be directly chosen by the people, which means we have to have elections because the Constitution clearly says it. The only way that we could stop having elections is if we remove that from the Constitution. The only way you can remove that from the Constitution is if the Australian people consent to it through a referendum, which we learn about in Area of Study 2. Um, Also, we can start looking at what is meant by directly chosen by the people. So, what does it actually mean to be directly chosen by the people? Which people? How many of the people? And the High Court, because we're talking about the High Court's ability to protect this idea of representative government, the High Court's heard a case on this. It's heard a few cases on this idea of representative government. And the High Court has interpreted and provided meaning to this concept of directly chosen by the people. And that meaning that they provided was that a substantial majority of the population must vote in an election. So we're going to unpack what that means in a moment. So here's Section 7. Have a read through that. You can find your own copy of the Constitution, obviously, and read that at any time. But there's Section 7. Have a read of that, and you'll see here very clearly 6 years, terms of 6 years, and directly chosen by the people. So, super clear. Members of the Senate directly chosen by the people. Here's the equivalent for the Constitution of the House of Representatives. And again, the House of Representatives shall be composed of members directly chosen by the people. So, really, really clearly laid out in the Constitution that we must elect our members. We must directly choose them. A good High Court case that illustrates the High Court protecting this principle is a case called the Roach case. So we'll unpack the Roach case in facts, legal issues, decision, and impact, and show in practice how the High Court has protected this idea of representative government. So we have obviously a piece of legislation in Australia, a law passed by Parliament called the Commonwealth Electoral Act. Effectively, the current version of it was passed in 1918, and it's been just routinely amended since then. And the Commonwealth Electoral Act clearly says that you are not allowed vote, so you are disqualified from voting if you are currently in prison and serving a prison sentence of over 3 years. So 3 years or more, you lose your, in a way, right to vote in an election. But in 2006, so this is nearly 20 years ago now, they actually they actually amended the law. Parliament agreed to change the law and voted through an amendment. And this time, anyone serving a prison sentence was no longer able to vote. So those people in prison from 0 to 3 years all of a sudden lost their ability to vote because the law restricted them. Now, there was this woman in prison at the time. Her name was Vicky Lee Roach. And Vicky Lee Roach was on a 6-year sentence, so she couldn't vote anyway. But when this change was put through, she wasn't happy with it. She thought that she should be allowed to still vote because even though she was in prison, she was still a member of society. And because the Constitution says that our elected representatives must be directly chosen by the people. And she was saying, well, I don't get to choose them, so therefore we're not meeting what the Constitution says. So she challenged this law in the High Court and said, I should be allowed to vote. So what are the legal issues here? What are the legal issues around democracy? Well, it all centered around the interpretation of directly chosen by the people in Section 7 and 24, like I've said. If we are going to have our politicians be directly chosen, what does that actually mean? To what extent are the public required to vote? And, we could look at this on a scale and go, well, does directly chosen by the people mean everyone of all ages, and as soon as you're born, you get to vote? Or does it mean right down here, maybe what it used to be a very long time ago in a lot of countries, only males who own land. Because there was a time when you could only vote if you were a male who owned land. If only males who own land are voting, are our members considered directly chosen by the people? I think we would all say no. Of course not. Because that's not enough of the people to then say that, hey, the people that they vote for are directly chosen by the people. But if I also said everyone of all ages should vote, right through from the day you're born, so 1-year-old, 2-year-old, etc., they're voting, I think we would again all say, well, that doesn't seem reasonable either. To be directly chosen by the people, we don't need absolutely everyone to vote. So the reality is, directly chosen by the people sits somewhere in the middle here. And over time, we've built up from this point on the end, and we've allowed women to vote. We've allowed more people than just those that own land. We've had universal suffrage where women have been given the vote. Obviously, in Australia and other countries around the world, there's often been disenfranchised communities like Indigenous Australians in Australia, who are able to vote. In America, that might have been African Americans and their ability to vote, right through until in most places around the world, we've settled somewhere along here. And in Australia, that is everyone over 18. And that's considered the nice threshold to make sure that our politicians are directly chosen by the people. Vicky Lee Roach, when she's not able to vote because she's in prison, she's claiming that her or the Constitution has been breached by that law. And she's saying that we need to make sure that our threshold for directly chosen by the people is really far up this end. And she's saying that by clearly saying that members of the House of Reps and Senate have to be directly chosen by the people, that she actually has a right to vote. And voting can't be taken away from her like the Parliament has done. And that by taking the vote away from her and people like her, that they have limited the operation of representative government. So she's claiming she has a right to vote and she cannot have that taken away from her because of what the Constitution says. What was the decision? Well, they found in favour of Roach, but not to the full extent of what she was arguing. So they found that the Commonwealth law was unconstitutional, and as a result, they reverted the law back to what it was previously. So the High Court clearly said the Constitution establishes a system of, so this is the sort of language you want to use in an answer if we're talking about the role of the High Court. The High Court establishes a system of representative democracy in our Constitution. In order to uphold and maintain that system of representative democracy, a substantial majority of the population must be entitled to vote. So a substantial majority. What is a substantial majority? And that's what we'll do here. So what is a substantial majority? Well, the High Court said that's up to the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth can determine who can and cannot vote within reasonable limits. And the Commonwealth is able to actually take your ability to vote away from you if they have a substantial reason for doing so. And the court found that what is a substantial reason? What is a substantial majority? Well, removing the right to vote from all prisoners was excessive. Only those convicted of a serious offence should be denied the right to vote, which means these days you can't vote if you're in prison for longer than 3 years. They said that's the right number. If you're in prison for longer than 3 years and you've breached community standards to that extent, you're not allowed to vote. Anyone else in prison, less than 3 years, anyone out of prison, you all get to vote. And voting's compulsory in Australia, so you have to vote. So what's the impact of this decision? How has the High Court, or what has been the role of the High Court in protecting representative government? Well, the High Court has said, and they've clarified what representative government means. The Commonwealth has the ability to exclude people from voting if they have a substantial reason, and they are unsound mind, treason, or seriously violated community expectations. So you're in prison for longer than 3 years. But to have a system of representative democracy, the majority of the population must be able to vote. However, the Constitution does not include a right to vote. There is no implied right to vote. So if you wanted to look at this in a summed up sort of section, you can, this maybe would be a sample answer to a question about this, but we're not going to be asked a direct question on Section 7 or 24 anymore. This is what it might look like. The High Court has acted as a guardian of the Constitution. They have clarified the meaning of Section 7 and 24. They have clarified what representative democracy or representative government means. There's a good summary there that you can have a read through. But what is the role of the High Court in protecting the principle of representative government? Well, the role of the High Court is to clarify the Constitution, to provide more clarity on what the words mean, and in a way, to provide some rules around who can and can't vote. Our second listed constitutional check on lawmaking is the separation of powers. This is hopefully a concept you've come across before, but it is the theoretical political idea that we should have different bodies to make laws, so legislative power, different bodies to administer the laws, executive power, and different bodies to settle disputes arising under the law, judicial power. So this is the idea that we have Parliament make laws, the government run and administer the country, and then courts rule on any disputes that arise under the law. And that all these three things are meant to be completely separate from each other. So doing their own thing. Parliament makes the laws, government and government departments, Department of Home Affairs, Department of Immigration, the Australian Defence Force, etc. They actually then administer the laws and run the country. And then the judicial power, if we have a dispute that arises, we go to court. So the High Court and the other federal courts for the Australian Commonwealth government. How does this How does this put a check on Parliament? Well, it means power, theoretically, power is not concentrated in one body. There's not one person who's able to make a law, say you've broken it, and then convict you of breaking it. It has to go through different checks and balances to make sure that no one is abusing their power and acting in a way that is unjust. So this protects our individual rights because it means that there are, as I said, checks and balances on the Commonwealth Parliament. Parliament can't, for example, pass a law that says that they get to also act as a court because the Constitution prohibits them from doing that. Parliament can't pass a law to get rid of the courts or get rid of the High Court because the Constitution doesn't allow them to do that. So really, really clearly, we make sure that power is not concentrated in one body. And as a result, there are checks and balances on Parliament's lawmaking. And ultimately, we know that the High Court has the power to annul legislation. So the High Court can actually cancel laws made by Parliament if they are unconstitutional. And that is a direct check on Parliament's lawmaking. Our final one is express rights. And this is usually the most straightforward one and the one that people find the easiest to understand. So, obviously, or hopefully, we know what the concept of a right is. A right is something that you have, that is protected, that can't be taken away from you. And in our Constitution, we have 5 rights that are written. So 5 rights that are explicitly written into the Constitution, which means they can't be changed, they can't be removed, they're in there. Yeah? And they're pretty weird, the rights in our Constitution, the 5 of them. We have the right to limited freedom of religion, Section 116. So, not, maybe freedom of speech or freedom of movement, not maybe the right to an education, really big picture human rights, but like limited freedom of religion's pretty big right. We have freedom of religion in Australia, and that's a nice human right to have. But our other rights start getting a little bit odd. So Section 117 is one of our rights. You won't be discriminated against based on your state of residence. So technically, I shouldn't discriminate against people who come from Tasmania, but they bring it on themselves, I reckon. Sorry to any Tasmanians out there. Section 92, free interstate trade and commerce. So this is one of the rights that are protected, is that we should be able to move goods freely from Victoria to South Australia, for example, South Australia to Queensland, so on and so forth. Section 51, Clause 31, just terms for the acquisition of property. So if the Commonwealth compulsorily, I have lost my ability to speak, acquires your land, if they take it off you, they have to give you just terms for it. So they have to provide you with adequate compensation. And then Section 8 is our fifth express right in the Constitution. That is that you will have trial by jury for any Commonwealth indictable offences, not state indictable offences, because the state criminal system is dealt with by, the Victorian Parliament and Victorian Constitution, etc. But if you're charged with a Commonwealth indictable offence, you must have a trial by jury. So these are our 5 express rights. Now, you don't need to know these explicitly because they're not listed in the study design. You don't need to be able to name them, list them, remember them. But it does help you have a little bit of extra understanding about what our express rights are. So how do these express rights check Parliament's lawmaking? Well, these are actually the most direct check on Parliament's lawmaking. Parliament can't breach them. So it's a really straightforward check or limit on Parliament's lawmaking. Parliament can't pass laws that breach them. Parliament can't pass a law to take away or force you to follow a religion. Parliament can't pass a law that introduces tariffs from goods moving between Victoria and New South Wales. If Parliament does pass a law that breaches one of these rights, the High Court can declare that invalid. Obviously, if someone brings a case, for example, during COVID, this whole idea of free interstate trade or commerce, during COVID, Clive Palmer, Australian businessman, he couldn't get from Queensland to WA, and he claimed that he had to go to WA to do business, and WA wouldn't let him in because no one could get through the border. Clive took the WA government to the High Court and said his right to free interstate trade and commerce, because he needed to go to WA for business, was being restricted, and that effectively the border protections in WA needed to come down. They needed to basically not have the system that they had. And unfortunately for Clive, he wasn't successful in that challenge. But that shows you the ability that you have as an individual, if you believe you've been wronged, to actually initiate a claim and try and have a piece of legislation invalidated. Obviously, not everyone has the ability to do that, and Clive Palmer has some access to resources that most of us don't. But it is an illustration, nonetheless. So, our key skill here is evaluate. So, we haven't really seen evaluate for a while. And evaluate is effectively, I like to focus on that idea of value in there. So, give a value judgment. So evaluation is really developing a value judgment. How good or bad something is. And it's really important when we're saying how good or bad something is, that you are able to really truly consider how good or bad something is. You need to consider both sides. And then once you've considered both sides, clearly communicate an argument or an opinion at the end. So these are the sort of answers that you need to have a conclusion on, and you need to consider both sides leading into that conclusion. So if we're evaluating the means by which the Australian Constitution acts as a check on Parliament in lawmaking, we're considering how good they are as a check on Parliament in lawmaking, but also how bad they are, to be able to then come up with a value judgment on whether it is good at doing its job as a check and whether it is actually a good check. Is it good for the Australian population, or whether it's bad? So this is the sort of question that you could get, straight up, evaluate the express protection of rights as a check on Parliament in lawmaking. And you have to be like, well, hey, it's like pretty good because Parliament can't pass laws that, breach the express rights, and they're really clearly in the Constitution. However, there's only 5 of them. They're pretty weird. They're sort of pretty narrow in scope. It's not many of them. They could be more broad. As a result, we have to rely on statutory rights. These are really easy for Parliament to remove. However, you could argue that statutory rights are better because Parliament can be responsive to the needs of the community. Ultimately, express rights aren't a very good check on Parliament in lawmaking because even though they stop Parliament making laws in that area, there's just not enough of them. Therefore, they're not a very good check. And that would be what we would be trying to work through in an evaluation. So considering both sides, hey, it's good as a check like this, but it has these limitations, ultimately putting forward a conclusion or a viewpoint. Now, this could be this question. You could get a question that says evaluate the separation of powers as a check on Parliament in lawmaking. Or you could get a question that says evaluate the longer one to write, but the role of the High Court in protecting government as a check on Parliament and lawmaking. And you'd be able to talk through, again, good parts of this and maybe the bad parts as well. Or you could just get a straight up evaluate the ability of the Australian Constitution or the means by which the Australian Constitution acts as a check on Parliament and lawmaking, and then you could talk about more than one. Here is a very comprehensive list of the sort of evidence you could use in an answer about any of these concepts. I'll briefly go over some of it, but it's stuff that you can easily read and jot down in your notes. Like I said, express rights, really straightforward. They're entrenched. Parliament can't pass laws that breach them. Great check, really good check. But you've got to bring a case. There's not many of them, and it's really hard to add more. So maybe they're not actually very good at being a check on Parliament and lawmaking, considering both sides. Separation of powers, separate judiciary, High Court can declare laws invalid, no one body holds absolute power, good check. However, government could get control of both houses of Parliament, which means separation of powers is no longer checking Parliament. Judges are appointed by the government. Could that be an issue? And that crossover between the executive and the legislative branch. So considering that side of things. And then High Court, High Court can declare laws invalid again. Government has to act in the interest of the people, representative government. And, if the right arguments and the right case is brought, the High Court could actually extend the concept of representative government. Maybe a 16-year-old takes the government to the Commonwealth to court and says directly chosen by the people should include 16 and 17-year-olds, and it currently doesn't. And maybe the High Court could say, yeah, it should. And as a result, the Commonwealth is forced to change its laws to allow 16-year-olds to vote. So that's the sort of thing that could happen, probably unlikely, but nonetheless. However, again, got to bring a case. It's costly. It takes a long time. Plus, there's no implied right to vote. We don't actually have a right to vote. Just a substantial majority of us should be able to. Few links here. This is a link to the Commonwealth Electoral Act. You can go and have a look, have a read through, find the section that runs through who can and can't vote. Might be worthwhile having a bit of a read. Reading legislation can just be a helpful tool anyway when you're studying, just to try and start, I guess, getting used to it. So as we get more into law reform in our next area of study and we're potentially looking at potential laws, we're just used to reading legislation and how it looks. And this is just a, Australian Human Rights Commission, I think it is, a government website that's just going to run you through how our rights are protected. So considering things like constitutional rights versus statutory rights, etc. ultimately, if someone is waving that constitution at you and being like, "What's this doing here? Why do we need this?" You'll be really clearly able to say, "Hey, this is why we need it." It helps limit the power that Parliament has. It puts restrictions and checks on Parliament, and here's why that's a good thing. So, how does the Australian Constitution act as a check on Parliament and lawmaking? Well, through the High Court, through representative government, through the separation of powers, through express rights. Yeah. Happy studying. Yeah, we'll see you in video 417.